And now I'm honored to introduce the opening keynote lecturer of Chess Conference 2016. Kevin Crowston is a distinguished professor of information science in the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University, New York. He received his PhD in information technologies from the Sloan School of Management, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. His research examines new ways of organizing that are made possible by the extensive use of information and communications technology. His specific research topics include the development of practices for free, libre, open source software teams, and work practices, as well as technology support for citizen science research projects. Both of them are conducted with support of the National Science Foundation. He is currently a co-editor-in-chief for the journal Information, Technology, and People. I'm very glad to invite Professor Crowston to deliver the lecture titled Citizen Science, Learning to Effectively Contribute in Virtual Organizations. Kevin, the floor is yours.
So, thank you for that very kind introduction. There'll be a brief pause while I set up my computer. So it's a very big honor to have been asked to come speak today. I've enjoyed my visit a lot, and I'm hoping that I can spend a few minutes with you talking about citizen science, and in particular how learning happens in citizen science environments. All right, thank you. So citizen science projects are okay. So perhaps the side students will come up in a minute. So citizen science projects are those research projects that are done as a partnership between volunteers and scientists. And an important characteristic of citizen science is that the projects actually do real science. So it's not just pretending to do science, but it's actually contributing to real science. The term citizen science is relatively new. It was coined by a guy named Rick Bonney about a decade or 15 years ago. But the concept is actually very well established. For example, ornithologists, the scientists who study birds, have been calling on the public's help to identify and find birds for more than a century. There's a project called the Christmas bird count, for example, that started in the late 1800s. And in fact, the Audubon Society's Great Backyard Bird Count just started Friday. So that's an annual event the Audubon Society has where they get the public to look at the kind of birds that they have in their backyards and to report those so that the scientists have a better sense of where the birds are. And in fact, the new term, in some ways, citizen science, is not very helpful because it seems to imply that you need to have a passport in order to be able to do science, that if you're not a citizen, somehow you can't do it. So other people use the term public participation in scientific research. The problem with that, of course, is that it's quite a mouthful, even if you abbreviate it, PPSR. So for this talk, I'm just going to stick with the term citizen science. But you should know that it's a very old term, very old concept that's had a lot of different names over the years. Right now, citizen science. So my talk is going to have three parts. I'm going to start off by talking about some examples of citizen science projects, just to give a sense of the different kinds of things that people do and some of the key characteristics of those projects. I'm then going to talk about how learning happens in citizen science projects, drawing on some research that I and my colleagues and students at Syracuse University have been doing with a particular project. And then I'm going to wrap up by discussing some possible future research opportunities that seem to be possible in this environment. So with that, I'm going to dive right in with some examples of different kinds of citizen science projects. So in a lot of sciences, like in bird watching, one of the main problems is just getting enough data. There are not that many ornithologists. There are very many birds. The birds are spread out where the scientists aren't. And so there are a number of citizen science projects that have the public help by collecting data where they are and reporting it in a way that the scientists can use. So a particular example of that that's been quite successful is this one about birds called eBird. It's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and as you can see, it's actually in cooperation with the Audubon Society, so they're one of the co-sponsors of the Backyard Bird Count. The way this one works is it takes advantage of the fact that bird watching is a very popular hobby. At least it is in the US. I think it is in Israel also. And so it turns out that bird watchers like to keep lists of the birds they've seen. Actually, is anyone here a bird watcher? A few people? And so you have your life list, all of the birds you've ever seen. And in fact, many of the bird watchers even keep them for every time they go bird watching. They'll list which birds they saw. And so what eBird does is provide a system where if you're a bird watcher, you can go in and list which birds you saw at a particular time and where you saw them. And so that's good for the bird watchers because they now have this list, but it also creates this data which is very useful for the scientists. And in fact, eBird then takes a step farther and asks people to report a little bit of additional data that makes the sightings of the birds much more useful for science. In particular, how much time you spent looking for the birds. So there's a difference between seeing a bird immediately and spending hours and hours and hours before you see one. The system also provides extensive filtering in order to improve the data quality. And so data quality is one of those things that's a big concern in citizen science. If you have ordinary citizens, ordinary volunteers doing something, how do you make sure the data are valid for science? So in the case of eBird, there's a lot of filtering, some of it automatic, some of it manual. So for example, if you report a very, very common bird, it just goes into the database. If you report something which is very uncommon or not seen in the particular environment, then that'll get filtered out. There may even be a human follow-up where they ask for information. One of the interesting things is they take advantage of what they know about the volunteer. So if it's someone who's an expert birder, then maybe that gets a little bit more credit. If it's someone who's brand new, like myself, then it might get ignored. And the data are very useful for science. So you can figure out where the birds are. You can create beautiful graphics like this, which shows the migration of the birds from South America to North America during the summer, and then back to South America in the winter. The data was useful, for example, during the Gulf oil spills some 8 or 9 years ago when they wanted to be able to identify which birds were in danger from the oil. It's been used to look at climate change, the effects of habitat change. There are quite a number of scientific publications that draw on eBird data just because it's such a valuable resource for ornithologists. And in fact, it's used to support a report put out called The State of the Birds. So every few years, there's a report in the United States describing what's happening with the bird populations that draws heavily on eBird data. And because this problem of getting widespread data is so common, there are many, many projects that work like this. So for example, meteorologists would like to have much finer data about where the rain is falling. And so in the US, there's a cooperative venture called CocoRoss in which volunteers collect rain and snowfall data. And those data are so reliable that they're actually included in the US Weather Service reports alongside the official government data. So it's just part of the data set. And I read a recent news report that listed about 40 groups in Israel that are doing similar kinds of data collection, so observing birds, butterflies, and so on. So those are data collection projects. In other sciences, the problem is not getting the data, but doing something with it. In particular, in fields like astronomy, but other kinds of fields, there are these new automated data collection techniques. So in astronomy, it's satellites like the Hubble Space Telescope. In marine sciences, people are putting automated instruments out into the ocean to collect data. And these new automated tools are creating every day as much data as the scientists had collected in the entire life of the project before that. So in astronomy, for example, the Hubble puts out literally gigabytes of data every day. The successor system is going to put out terabytes of data every day. And that data need to be analyzed. And some of the analysis can be done automatically, but in many cases, the kind of interpretation you need to make is still something that's hard to do. And so you need human eyes. So this is a project, actually, unfortunately, with the lighting, you can't really see it, but that's a picture of a galaxy in the middle, so you can see a very faint blur. And a group of scientists at Oxford wanted to know very simple things about these galaxies, like, for example, what shape they were, if they were a spiral galaxy, whether they went clockwise or counterclockwise. And the computer technology the vision processing wasn't quite good enough to do that. So they did what most scientists do in this sense. They got a doctoral student, and they sat the doctoral student in an office in front of the images. And after a couple of months, the doctoral student had classified a few thousand images, and unfortunately, they had about 1 million. So they came up with the idea of putting the images up on a website, asking volunteers to contribute. They thought that if they got a few hundred people, they could probably get through the images in a year or two. In the actual event, they had so many volunteers that the server crashed. And they were completely overwhelmed, and they actually got through all of the data within a few months. The grad student says there was a very sad point at which, within a few days, the volunteers had done more images than he had done in the months previous. So he realized that a single person was just not the way to do this. And in order to get reliable answers, in this case, what you do is you simply have multiple volunteers work on each image, and you take the consensus. So if 7 out of 10 people say it's clockwise, then you go with clockwise. And these data, again, have been very useful. There's a number of publications that draw on Galaxy Zoo data and some of the successors to that. But one of the interesting side effects of having humans look at all these images is that they occasionally spot unexpected things. And I'm not quite sure if you can see it in this image. It's a little bit dark. But we have a galaxy here on your left. And you can see this green blob, which is attacking it. So at the time, nobody knew what the green blob was. It's been named since then Hanny's Forewarp, after its discoverer, Hanny von Arkel, who is a Dutch school teacher and an active volunteer in the Galaxy Zoo project, who was the first one to spot this and bring it to the attention. And at the time it was discovered, no one knew what it was. Since then, it's been worked out to be a very rare kind of object called a Quasar Echo. And it was discovered not by a professional astronomer, but by a member of the general public who is taking part in the Galaxy Zoo project. And since then, the Galaxy Zoo volunteers actually organized themselves. They searched systematically. They found about 19 examples of things like this. Astronomers were the one who figured it out, but Hanny was the one who discovered it. And she, in fact, if you notice at the end of the first line, is one of the authors on the paper announcing its discovery. So this is an example of a volunteer doing real science and making real scientific discoveries. Inspired by the success of the Galaxy Zoo, the researchers at Oxford and now also at Adler Planetarium in Chicago have created the Zooniverse, which is a collection of many projects. There are quite a number of them in astronomy, which is where they started, but also in different kinds of natural sciences, and even in the humanities. So for example, one that my girlfriend likes quite a lot is transcribing letters from Shakespearean times, where you have to actually learn how to read the old handwriting and help to transcribe the letters. There's a bunch of projects. Just to give you another example, this is a popular one called Snapshot Serengeti that has images from camera traps set up on the Serengeti Plains in Africa. There's a few other projects where there are camera traps that have been set up in other parts of the world, including in Chicago. And you're asked to classify what kind of animal you see so as to get a better sense of the animals that are in the area. Another popular astronomy one is called Planet Hunters, which takes these images. They're showing the intensity of a star as it varies over time, and you're looking for evidence of orbiting planets. And to date, there have been 3,000 discoveries of extrasolar planets that have been discovered with Kepler, and Planet Hunters is one of the ways that people have identified those, having humans look at these images, looking for the transits. This is a project we spent a fair amount of time studying, so I'll come back to it in a bit. In my group at Syracuse, we actually did do some exploration with citizen science projects. We were interested in using games as a motivation for things that are less popular than galaxies or wild animals. In our case, we had a project around moths. So we had a lightly gamified version. We actually had a full-blown adventure game with robots. In the interest of time, though, I'm going to skip those and go on to some other things. But if anyone wants more information about our project, I'd be happy to share it. Most of the ones I've shown you so far, the kind of human processing is very simple. You know, look at an image, say if it's clockwise or counterclockwise, or if something's a gazelle or something else. There are some projects that take more complicated kinds of tasks. So this is a project called Foldit, which is trying to figure out the structure of proteins, which is quite important to understanding how the protein functions. And it takes advantage of the human's ability to see three-dimensional configurations. So it asks the volunteers to figure out a way of folding up the protein. And this is a project problem that turns out to be extremely hard for computers to do. The best computer solutions are, sort of so-so. And the best volunteers can beat the computers by a large degree. And it's interesting because no one quite understands what the volunteers are doing, but they've identified different sorts of heuristics, different approaches to try to do the folding. So this is a particular protein that the Foldit volunteers worked on. You might recognize it as the Mason-Pfizer monkey virus retroviral protease. The reason that that's important is that it was an important piece in understanding HIV, so the virus that creates AIDS. So this is the monkey equivalent of that. Researchers had been trying to figure out its structure for 2 or 3 years. They gave it to the Foldit volunteers who solved it in 3 weeks. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of, again, volunteers doing real science. And what's interesting, especially about Foldit, is that groups of people can cooperate on the task. They can share partial solutions, they can share techniques and ideas. And you'll notice that on the paper announcing the solution, 2 of the authors are these groups from Foldit, the Foldit Contenders group and the Foldit Void Crushers group. So they're actually credited as part of the project. So that, I think, will give you a sense of some of the different kinds of citizen science projects out there. There are other ones I'll talk about a bit later as well. So the question is, what are people learning in these sorts of projects and how do they do it? So that's the next thing I want to talk to is learning in citizen science. So some projects do have an explicit educational focus. This is a project sponsored by NASA, for example, called Radio Jove, Jove being Jupiter. And it actually develops educational materials around looking for radio signals from Jupiter and other places in the world. But many other projects have education just as a side effect or sort of a side piece. And I'm mostly going to focus on projects like Zooniverse, in part because of my interest in virtual work, and in part because Zooniverse enrolls literally millions of people. There are millions of people, more than 1 million people with accounts on Zooniverse, and so it just has a much larger scale kind of impact. One of the concerns about studying learning in that environment is that when you survey people, and this is the results of a survey done asking people why they participate, it turns out that learning is not very high on the list of why people say they do the project. So this is a somewhat confusing figure. What it shows is 10 different reasons that people were asked how important they are as a reason to do the citizen science projects. It's actually listed from the bottom up in terms of importance. So the one at the bottom, contribute, is the one that people listed most often as their first choice. So 40% of people said that the reason they did it was to be able to contribute to science. And the second was astronomy. People just said that they liked astronomy. That was the second most popular reason. And then going across, what it shows is what score someone who said contribute was the first choice gave to all the other options. And so you'll see at the bottom, for example, that if you said contribute was your first choice in red, you scored contribute fairly highly. But interestingly, the people who said contribute was their first choice also rated science as pretty highly. So just being interested in science. And the thing which is alarming is first, learning, as you can see, is very much near the top. And because this is a backwards chart, that means that it was rated, it was not the first choice of many people. In fact, fewer than 2% of the people said that they did the project to learn. But even more alarming, if you look across, learning is in green, which is to say a much lower score. So even people who thought some other reason was important did not say that learning was very important to them. So basically, when you survey people, very few of them say that they're doing these things in order to learn. But of course, they are learning. They are learning some. So one thing they're learning is how to do the task. For Galaxy Zoo, it's a fairly simple task. Is this round or is it a spiral? Which way does the spiral go? But for some other things, like, for example, this light curve, identifying where the transit are, you can see that this is not something that anyone can just glance at and do, be able to identify the transit. So clearly, something's going on that people are able to learn how to do this task. And basically what the task is, as I said, they're looking for evidence of planets around stars elsewhere in the universe. And so you can see that if a large planet goes across, it blocks off part of the sun, the star, and so there'll be a dip in the intensity of the light. And of course, the smaller planet will make a smaller dip. The planets go around the sun, the stars, at some periodicity, so you'll see dips every now and again. So one of the ways people are learning to do this, obviously, is by looking at these formal educational materials, like, for example, the slide I just showed you, which was actually one of the things in the tutorial for Planet Hunters. And there's a number of other science resources like that, guides to the site. And these are maintained by the project science team. So each of these citizen science projects has a group of scientists who are involved, the people involved with CUPRA, for example, who will create these. So if you analyze how these things are working, this is what Sorensen, the researcher Sorensen, described as an authority-subject presence. So basically, there's an authority, me, at the front of the room, in this case, and then there are the subjects. That's all of you out there in the audience. If you think about a conventional classroom, there's sort of a distinction in the space where the teacher operates at the board. That's the teacher space, the place where the students are operating, the student space. And the spaces are then separated, where one of them is the authority, giving the guidance. The other is where the people are actually doing the work. So we have this learning separated from the doing. We have a space in which you go to learn about how to do citizen science, and then a space where you actually do the citizen science. And those are separated. And in this case also, the volunteers' practice is isolated because they simply are interacting with these light curves, and they don't have interaction with each other. So this is a very traditional mode of learning and education. A lot of people have critiqued it. In fact, many people would say that for these sorts of things, the right model of learning is not so much the teacher and the student, but the apprenticeship model, where it's actually learning by doing. So learning is not just transmission of abstract, decontextualized knowledge from one person who has it to another person who needs it, but a process that takes place through expansion of knowledgeable practices. And in fact, some of the projects do have something in that direction. For example, in Planet Hunters, and again, it may be too dim to be able to really see, but over here, there's actually image. There was a simulated transit, so they actually put in an artificial transit that they knew was there, and then if you missed it when you were doing the classification, the system would actually point it out. It would say, hey, there was a transit there, here's what it looked like. So you can see in this case, we're actually starting to blend the doing and the learning, that people are actually doing the process of classification and the system is helping them to learn. But this is still very isolated. People are still doing it on their own. And what Sorensen would point to is the possibility of a more communal kind of presence, where people are actually learning in a social process. The volunteers are not just oriented towards the task, but also oriented towards each other and learning from each other. And in fact, this is the basis of a very popular learning theory that I'm sure almost everyone in this room knows about, which is Lav and Wenger's legitimate peripheral participation, that argues that the way newcomers to a task learn to take part in the task is by having access to participate in and observe the practices of the community. So they're sort of classic example of this working. The participant can actually very much like a doctoral student at the conference. They can sit on the edge. They can see how other people in the community behave, what a good practice looks like. And if you're off in the corner, isolated, it makes it impossible to learn. But of course, if you think about these citizen science projects where someone is just confronting this, it's very difficult to see how this peripheral participation might take place, because really all you see is just the, this is supposed to be an animation, let's see if it happens. All you see is the curve, you see the questions, you answer the questions, you can't really see the practice at all. And so, so we were thinking that it would be very hard to understand these sort of more social aspects of the learning. But one thing that we came across is this possibility for another mode of interaction. So not just the task itself, but you'll notice this final question here. Would you like to talk about this star? So originally, when the people who created Galaxy Zoo put it together, they had put these discussion boards there sort of as a side line. It was sort of an afterthought. It was the idea that maybe the volunteers would want to do a little bit of socialization or have a place to ask questions. So they put up this discussion board. And what they discovered was that the discussion boards were actually a very important part of doing the science. So for example, the foreword that I showed you, that was actually discussed in the discussion fora. Hanny basically posted an image saying, hey, so this image, you know what's going on in it, and that's where the discussion about it happened. But the thing we noticed is that in the talk, and again, it's perhaps a little bit small to see, you actually have these hints about the practice, that people will post notes where they say how they did the classification, what they saw, what they thought was interesting. And in fact, when we were doing interviews with some of the new participants, many of them pointed out how helpful those talk comments were in helping them to learn to do the transit. So for example, there's a quotation down here from one of the newcomers. We gave her the pseudonym of Emily. Oh, this is what a bigger transit looks like. Oh, this is what smaller transit looks like. Oh, this is what not a transit looks like. And I just kind of figured it out with the examples of what you found is if what you found is something worthy or not, right? So she's basically pointing to the fact that these discussion comments that people have been posted help her to see how you might interpret one of these images that you're looking at, which otherwise are basically just dots on the screen. Somewhat more experienced user commented similarly. There were certain people who seemed to have experts, and when they commented, I took their comments as a learning experience. So basically taking these different kinds of posts as a way not to see the practice directly, but to see sort of this reflection of it. We did a survey with about 100 newcomers, asking them what they found useful for learning. And it's quite striking that things like the site guide and the help, most people thought were helpful. But nearly as helpful is talk, and not talk as a place to ask questions and get answers, but talk as a place to see the practice being explained. But of course, not all of the comments are equally helpful. So Lav and Wenger point out that observation of work practices is valuable to newcomers when it gives them access to the context of the practice and the specifics of the work. So you need to have the context in which you do something. You need to have the specifics of what the work looks like. And these comments that people leave can vary in specificity and in context. So for example, you can see this one here is full of lots and lots of very specific details. It says what the star is. So this is an eclipsing binary star. It helps to explain why the pattern of the light goes up and down. There's two stars, one of which is brighter than the other. So when the brighter one's in front, the light is brighter. When the dimmer one is in front, then the light is less bright. It has the numbers about when things are happening, so you can actually orient to the graph and figure out what's going on. So this is a case where we have a lot of detail that helps somebody to see what it is that they might have seen in this image afterwards. So to recap, the attributes that seem to make these comments, which we're calling practice proxies, because they're actually acting as a proxy for the practice, help new volunteers to see the general characteristics that they should consider when they're doing the annotation, draws attention to some of the specific characteristics, so you know exactly where a dip is or exactly where a transit might occur, and in some cases raises questions about the images that help other people, again, orient towards the image and see what it is that they ought to be looking for. And you can contrast that to a very, very general top comment like beautiful image or neat transit or this is a good one, which doesn't give you any insight at all into what the practice ought to be. So in summary, we have this sort of interesting situation where the practices, because this is a virtual environment, are not very visible. But the way that people talk about it gives you a lot of insight into what they've been doing that helps you to see what you might do as well. We had this idea that these proxies were something useful for learning. To test this, we've actually been running an experiment for the last several months, and we haven't completely finished the data analysis yet. We're still trying to convince ourselves that what we see is real. But what we did was to create an experiment using Mechanical Turk. We made a sort of dummy version of the site. It has a set of images, some of which have various obvious transits. People can see the transits. And it asks the Mechanical Turkers to click where they see the transits. So in this case, they would click on those three areas there, showing where the transits occurred. Because these are images for which we know what the correct answer is, we can actually give people a score. So basically, it's divided between clicking on the places where there is a transit, not clicking on the places where there isn't. So in this case, I would have gotten a perfect score for this image. But of course, not all the images are equally easy. For example, this one, you can see there's quite a lot of noise, and it's a lot harder to see where the transits would be. And then we divided the subjects randomly into 3 conditions. So there's a control condition where they didn't see any comments at all. There's a high specificity, high context condition in which they saw images, comments like this one down here. I don't know if you can see it. I see transits at day 3, day 18, and day 32. So that would allow a user who saw that comment to look at this image and say, okay, so day 3, you know, what do I see there? Day 18, and so on. And then a third condition where they got comments, but the comments were not very, did not have context and specificity. Just things like, you know, clear transits in this image. All right, so everyone get the setup for the experiment. So we have people recruited on Mechanical Turk. We did some screening to make sure that, for example, they didn't know what a transit was. So these are very much like the newcomers. This is a plot showing the average for those 3 groups. So what I did is I subtracted out the control group, the score the control group got. So that's the 0 line across the middle is the average score in the control group. Blue is the low context, low specificity. Orange is the high context, high specificity. And you'll see across the 20 images, HCHS doesn't always do better. You know, sometimes it does spectacularly worse. But in general, there's this upward trend as over time, the high context, high specificity people start to do better. And in fact, as far as we can tell from the regressions we're running, that is statistically significant, whereas the difference between control and LCLS is not significant. So experimental evidence that these practice proxies actually are supporting people learning how to do the task in this particular setting. And keep in mind, this experiment was done on Mechanical Turk with people from Mechanical Turk who have none of the motivations for doing the task. They're not especially interested in astronomy or in science. They're not even getting paid more for getting answers right. And yet they're still apparently learning how to do the task. So to just wrap up this part of the talk, to summarize, we found that practice proxies do seem to help newcomers in 3 ways. First, they help the newcomers to orient their practice towards the characteristics of the data that they should pay attention to. So as it says, new users, this is a quote from one of the moderators, new users, when they're becoming acclimated, can look at the work other users have posted and get tips on what is a transit. I know it helped me a lot when I was doing it to hear some of this discourse. So basically a way of trying to understand what to look at. It also helps newcomers because it gives them a way to judge how well they did. For various technical reasons, the site never tells you whether you're right or not, because at the time you do it, actually they don't know whether you're right or not. It's only until they've gotten the judgments of 10 people or so and they can figure out what the consensus was that they actually have a sense of what the right answer is. So at the time you do the task, really it's brand new, there's no way of knowing whether or not you were right. But then comparing what you saw to what other people are seeing helps you to understand, okay, so maybe I missed something, or maybe this other person saw something I didn't. And then finally, it helps you to understand what kind of questions you might ask about the object, just seeing what other kinds of questions other people are asking. So, as I said, in these virtual worlds where it's very hard to understand what communal presence might look like, and especially communal presence around these sorts of practices, in this setting with the talk, we can see talk as a proxy for the practice that helps people to learn how to do it. All right, so at that point, I want to now switch to some ideas for future research. So one possibility is simply to look to see if practice proxies are useful for explaining learning in other kinds of virtual settings. So for example, in Wikipedia, it seems very open. You can see the articles. If you click on the history button, you can see every edit that someone made. But it's also clear that you don't see a lot of the practice that went into making the edit. You don't see how people decide what might need changing. You don't see how they do the research, how they craft the sentences, how they build agreement that these are good changes. And recently there's been a real decline in the number of editors, at least in the English language Wikipedia. And part of it is that it's just much harder to contribute than it used to be. It used to be that Wikipedia was the encyclopedia that anyone can edit. Now it's the encyclopedia that anybody who's willing to read all the rules and to learn the practices and to put up with the existing community and to get themselves involved can edit. So not quite as good of a catchphrase. Sorry? Yes. Yes, ready to have your work deleted, yes, and to persevere. And it's very, very unclear how people are supposed to learn those practices, given that Wikipedia is this virtual project where you can't see it. So there have been some attempts to do the more authoritative subject kind of presence, putting up guides to newcomers, tutorials about how to do it and so on. There have been some communal things face-to-face, having Wikipedia user groups or new edit days or hackathons and such, editathons I should say in the case of Wikipedia. Another possibility though is to look at the talk pages, because every Wikipedia article has a talk page, and just to see whether the talk pages provide enough evidence, enough of the proxy for the practice to help people to learn what those practices are. Similarly in open source, again, the code is open, the contributions are open, but there's a large amount of work that's not visible. Understanding a bug report or a feature request, debugging, designing, coding, testing, and so on. And so again, it would be interesting to look at the kinds of discussion that goes on around these changes to see whether there's sufficient information there, context specificity to help people to really learn the practices or not. In the case not, then a follow-on question would be, what can you do to encourage more useful practice proxies in these discussions? So in the case of citizen science, for example, working with the people at Zooniverse, we've just implemented this. I don't know if you can see it down here, but it's a helpful button. So when you post a talk comment, and in this case, this is for a project called Whales as Individuals, where you basically annotate pictures of whale fins to help the scientists keep track of individual whales. You can tell them apart by their fins. So the idea with the helpful button is to encourage people to leave more helpful posts by getting that kind of social feedback. So if you think that a post was particularly helpful, we're hoping that you will click on the helpful button. And then the question is, what kind of use can we make of that feedback that something was or was not helpful to encourage more people to contribute more helpful posts? And we're still trying to figure out exactly what the best use of the feedback is. So if you have ideas about that, that would be helpful. Another kind of research topic is to look at the demographics of citizen science. This is a slide that I borrowed from Carney, Roddick, Reed, and Cook. It was part of their presentation a little while ago, reporting on a survey of Galaxy Zoo, actually Zooniverse. They had about a dozen Zooniverse projects where they surveyed people. And it turns out that the average volunteer on the citizen science project is about 40, 2/3 male, mostly college educated or higher, mostly working in a technical or a skilled job. The largest part was from the US. Another big chunk was from other US-speaking, English-speaking countries. And in some ways, this should not be surprising, because this actually is the profile of science-interested people. So if you survey people who are interested in science, you'll get a very similar profile. So perhaps it's not very surprising that people who are interested in science are also the ones contributing to the citizen science projects. But it does suggest that the projects are not really achieving the goal of broadening participation in science all that well. So I think understanding who citizen science appeals to, why it appeals, and what you could do to attract a more diverse group of participants is a really interesting challenge. And this actually is also one that generalizes to other kind of virtual projects. So Open source has terrible problems with the diversity of participants. Wikipedia, not quite as bad as open source, but still an issue. And in cases like open source and Wikipedia, and to some not so much in citizen science, the kind of output that those projects create is very much a product of the people who are involved. And so if Wikipedia is attracting not a representative group of people, it's hard to see how it's going to create a very representative encyclopedia. So this is not only an intellectual challenge, but I think a real social issue as well. Another kind of broadening is in the scope of tasks that people work on in citizen science projects. Most of the ones I've shown you up until now have focused just on this middle part. So either collecting data or analyzing data. And there's a nice framework from Shirk and Bonnie. Bonnie is the one, by the way, who coined citizen science, where they basically point out that there's a lot more to science than just collecting or analyzing data. And that it's interesting to think about how you would involve volunteers in more of these tasks. So a collaborative project where they're actually helping to develop explanations, designing the data collection, analyzing and interpreting the data, or even a co-created project where the volunteers are helping to define what the questions are. In some ways, we did see some examples of this. The FORWIRP is an example where someone who was doing this contributory part actually started to do more analysis of the data. The search for the FORWIRPs was again one where the volunteers came up with the question and the data collection techniques to try to drive it forward. Zooniverse actually had another project that was very specifically aimed at trying to get people involved in more aspects called Zooniverse Quench. One of the problems there, and actually with the first example, is that the number of people who do it is very, very small. So as I mentioned, some of the Zooniverse projects will have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of volunteers doing the data classification. The Zooniverse Quench project, by the end, when they were starting to write up the paper, had 4 people left. So the scale is just very disproportionate. There are a number of citizen science projects that really are a lot more co-created. There's a bunch, for example, around water resource monitoring, like this one here, in which groups are using the science to solve local problems. So for example, in this case, they're using scientific techniques to monitor the water quality in their area in order to be able to understand what kinds of threats the water faces and what you could do about it. But the control in this case really is with the volunteers instead of the scientists. But the thing is that these are not really advancing science, so it's a very different kind of impact. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, there are projects that are focused on education. I think another interesting idea is to think about how citizen science projects can be incorporated into existing educational settings. So for example, this is a blog called SciStarter. They have a lot of suggestions for how you might use citizen science projects in science classrooms. And that kind of blending of formal scientific education and informal science education, I think, has a lot of potential and might both help to broaden participation and also provide support for some of the activities on the previous slide, where you can actually imagine more scaffolding for volunteers to take part in the projects. So lastly, I want to talk about how we might think about citizen science going forward. If you remember, I started with the Galaxy Zoo, and you can barely see a galaxy in the middle of the picture. Part of the reason that they started off looking for human volunteers was just that at the time the task was beyond the capabilities of the computer systems to do. It was just too hard for computers. But in the last couple of years, there's been an enormous advance in, especially in image processing, in an area called deep learning. And this is an example of a system from Google that does deep learning just to classify what image they're looking at. And as you can see in the top, it does remarkably well. You just give it an image and it says, okay, that's a container ship, that's a leopard. Even in cases where it gets it wrong in sort of the way a human might. So this image here was classified as grill. The system said convertible, which is probably what I would have said. It was unable to tell the difference between 2 different kinds of mushrooms, which is not too surprising. And of course, occasionally it gets it wrong, but again, in ways that don't seem all that unexpected. So part of what made these systems work, these deep learning systems, is the use of machine learning. And machine learning, I think, is interesting because it has this loop like this, where we have humans do the initial classification. So literally millions of images tagged with, that's a container ship, those are cherries, that's a convertible, which are then fed into the machine learning algorithms to develop a program that can identify images. So one thing that we want to do in this project we're working on is to try to close the loop, to really start to think about how you might use machine learning to train the humans, so that when we have a new volunteer join the project, that we can actually use the machine learning so that they're doing real useful work, but they're doing things that we think will be easier for them to get started. And we're doing this in the context of a project called LIGO. LIGO you might have heard about because it was in the news just last Thursday. It's a project looking for evidence of gravitational waves. And in fact, last Thursday, they announced that they'd discovered it. So the waves are created when these very large objects, like in the case of last Thursday, black holes orbit around each other and the ripples go out. Black holes are among the most massive things in the universe, but by the time the signals come to Earth, they're so faint that it takes an incredibly sensitive machine to detect it. And in the case of LIGO, it's a detector which is 4 kilometers on a side. And the idea is that you shine laser light down the 2 arms of the L, and you look for slight changes in the distance, where one arm gets a little bit longer and the other one gets a little bit shorter. And the kind of change they're looking for is 1,000th the diameter of a protein. So 10 proton, 10 to the minus 21. So just this incredibly, incredibly sensitive detector. So the LIGO detector is about the most sensitive detector ever built. As a result, not only can it detect gravitational waves, it detects everything else as well. So trucks driving by, earthquakes, wind blowing overhead. One of the detectors is in Louisiana. People occasionally shoot at it. So all of those sorts of terrestrial noise. And the gravitational signals happen perhaps once a month. The terrestrial noise happens every few seconds. And so this was something that the author of PhD Comic, which, by the way, I highly recommend to everyone in the room, a guy named George Cham, described as trying to hear a song being hummed at a very, very, very loud cocktail party. There's just so much else going on that it drowns it out. So our project is to get the volunteers to help classify the noise so we can hear this. Whoops, is it going to play? Oh. Did that come out? People heard it? So, right. So imagine that in a very, very loud, crowded conference reception, and you'll get a sense of the problem. So we have a prototype of the system. It looks an awful lot like all the other Zooniverse projects. This is a plot of time versus frequency versus intensity. So you can see, noise shows up as a bit of a blip here, and we ask people to classify what kind they are. So far, this is very much like all the other projects. The notion, as I said, closing the loop, we want to have the machine learning pick out images that they think will be good for training, so ones that are particularly representative. So it won't be a training exercise in the sense that it's this pre-canned thing where when you do it, you're not adding any value for science. You'll still be doing useful work, classifying the images. You'll just be doing them on things that we think will be easier and a better learning experience. But the second thing we want to do is to actually let the volunteers create their own categories of glitch. Because unlike, for example, Snapshot Serengeti, where we pretty much know the animals that exist in Africa, in this case, we don't really know what kinds of glitches there are. There are 7 of them that have been identified so far, but there are probably dozens. So we want to make it possible for the participants to actually add to the knowledge base and not just implement it. And in doing that, we want them to be able to duplicate the kind of scientific detective work that the LIGO scientists do all the time. So as an example of that, there was a case where the scientists noticed that they had a number of glitches that had the similar kind of appearance. You can see this sort of horizontal line. And then By doing a bit more probing, they were able to find that the timing of those signals lined up with the timing of something else that was going on inside the detector. So the detector collects lots and lots of data about what's happening. And in particular, each of these signals seemed to correspond to the time when a particular air compressor was turned on. So that gave them then this hypothesis that there was something about the air compressor that was creating this noise. And sure enough, when someone went out to look at the air compressor, they discovered that a piece of the padding on the air compressor had broken down. So every time the air compressor turned on, it sent a jolt of noise into the system, creating the glitch. So in order for our volunteers to be able to do the same kind of thing, there's a lot of work we're going to have to do, which is the challenge for this project going forward. We have to build their background knowledge about how the detector works, where noise comes from. We have to give them the ability to form and test hypotheses about multiple images. We want to let them collaborate on that the way that they do in Foldit. So we can have a group of people, the LIGO glitch crushers perhaps, who will actually form hypotheses and share partial solutions. And we want to give them the ability to actually test those against the data in the system. And for each of these are also, I think, interesting possibilities for machine support. So for example, giving them examples of groupings to get them started, helping them test the hypotheses, look for other examples of what they found, and so on. So just to conclude, I hope what you'll take away from my talk today is, first of all, just knowing that there are projects called Citizen Science that involve members of the general public to support scientific research for data collection, analysis, and sometimes actually action. That in these sorts of virtual settings where people can't directly observe what other people are doing, that the way they talk about it can act as a useful proxy for the practice and provide support for that kind of learning, and that future research could look at a range of topics, including increasing the kinds of tasks that people can work on in the projects, broadening participation in science, and looking for ways to use machine learning to support the scientific research and learning processes in these teams. So thank you for your attention.